Welcome to Transformational Leadership, the podcast for leaders building high-performance organizations and teams. In every episode, you will hear from executives and transformation experts who've led with vision, executed under pressure, and delivered real, scalable, and impactful results. You'll hear practical insights and leadership stories from executives who've driven change, delivering transformation, and consistently winning in highly complex environments. No fluff. Just frameworks, lessons, and stories from the front lines of leadership. If you're serious about building competitive impact through people, you're in the right place. Here is your host, Jeff Harnois.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Transformational Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Harnois. My guest today is Bryan Chaney, founder of People Brand Collective, a professional organization for people-experienced storytellers, employer branding, recruitment marketing, internal communications, and engagement. His career includes some noteworthy brands, including Crunchyroll, IBM, Indeed.com, and Aon. Bryan is a self-proclaimed, unapologetic people nerd, which I love everything about that. And he's addicted to social connections, and I can't wait to learn more about that. Bryan was named one of Huffington Post's 100 most social HR professionals, which is, I'm certain, a story in itself. Today, we're going to be talking about organizational transformation from two perspectives: internal transformation and external transformation. And I'm excited for this conversation. With that, everyone, please join me in welcoming Bryan to the stage. Bryan, nice to see you.
Hey, good to see you, Jeff. Thanks so much for hosting and for having me.
My pleasure. I really love this concept of the difference between internal and external transformation. And I like it because we often focus on internal transformation. So I can't wait to hear about that contrast into external communication. Where would you like to start?
Well, I think it's important to understand that change affects all of us. And the difference between internal and external is, did you decide to make that change, or was that change thrust upon you? And so that's how I think about it between internal and external, and understanding how we react to it. I am an unapologetic people nerd. What that really means is I love hearing people's stories. I love seeing them react to things that happen. I love seeing them respond. I love understanding how they think and what they do when they feel like they are in a good position, and how they think and act when they feel challenged. That also means I like to play poker, but that's a whole nother topic, because I like, putting things out there, reading people, seeing their tells. But professionally, I get to hear these stories and elevate those stories from an employee perspective. So I've been doing this work for over 20 years, and absolutely, by far, the part of my job that I would do for free, but don't tell anybody, is hearing people's stories and being able to ask them questions to go deeper on why they made a decision, what brought them to that moment where they were sitting with me and having that conversation. What turns and twists did their career path or personal journey take? And then why they made those decisions, what keeps them in that role, and then what motivates them, what are they looking forward to next? And I think that's the part that I geek out about, is everybody is motivated by different things. So just learning, okay, why is that important? Well, and in work, it's usually because we were in some situation or a role or a team or a company that has certain things. And so we might want to think about the thing that we don't have. And it's interesting to see that, and that changes over time. So when you talk to somebody early in their career, they're motivated by certain things. You talk to somebody later in their career, it's completely different. What's important to them and what they focus on when they're thinking about the next step.
This is fascinating to me, and I'll just tell you, my brain is lighting up right now. I've got 1,000 questions, but I'll try and keep it to just a few here. The first question that's coming to my mind is, are you familiar with psychometrics, and have you ever had one? What is your Myers-Briggs, if you know?
So that one is an interesting one. So for me, it's actually changed over time. I actually prefer. Are you familiar with strength? So the strength.
Strength
Yep,
finders?
the Clifton Strength Finder. That one for me, I think tells a little bit more of a complete story. Everything from Strength Finder to DISC. There's all kinds of different ways, and it depends on the organization you're in, right? Like, what do they use? How can you actually leverage that? There was one that was done back when I was at Indeed, and everybody was red, yellow, green, or blue, and you knew exactly. They had little blocks, and people put them on their desks, and you knew what people's priorities were based upon what order their blocks were on their desk. And you invest in that because you have to be able to connect with people in the way that they need to receive that information.
Yeah. The reason I ask is, as I'm listening to you talking about what you're passionate about and what's driving you and, how you see and read and assess people, that's an attribute of the feeling type in Myers-Briggs or the F type. And, that's just, it's coming through so strongly for me. I was just trying to get confirmation if that was true for you.
Yes, there's absolutely an F there. Trust me.
Yeah. And, when we talk about organizational transformation, this idea, it was something that you said that sort of triggered this thought for me. We often do psychometric assessments on teams and whole organizations, and having that intel before we launch an organizational transformation of any kind, knowing that intel in advance allows us to do exactly what you said you're doing, which is I want to understand people's motivations. I want to understand how they think about, how they process information. Are they tactical versus strategy? What information do we need to communicate to get them to participate? So all of that whole theme was going off in my head as you were talking.
Yeah. I think it's important to understand that everybody's got their own story. And the word story and the concept of storytelling is way overused, but I love it anyway because you have to have a story. There's data, there's information everywhere. But the things that stick with you are the ones that come wrapped in a story that you can relate to. And so I don't think of storytelling as just the way of selling something. I look at it as how are you wrapping a human element around that data? Because if people don't understand how to think, respond, and feel about that thing, then it's not going to stick in their memory. We're pretty simple creatures at a base level. Psychologically, we're a little bit more complex, but when it comes to our needs, we have to feel something in order to remember it.
I want to drive that point home from two perspectives. The first one is just a saying that I often share in leadership development, which is people don't always remember what you say, but they always remember how you made them feel. And I think that that's just one of the most profound insights to never lose sight of. The second thing that came up for me is at Wharton, they did a little psychology experiment with several MBA cohorts. And what they did is they brought in people who came in with statistics to talk about how the business was performing. And then they brought a group of people in to tell stories about how the business was performing. And then they went back and they essentially tested the audience to say what was more memorable. And I think something like 10% of the statistics were remembered, were available for recall, and 80% of the stories were available for recall, just to drive your point home.
That totally makes sense. If you can think back to when you would be cramming for a test, maybe that's just me, but when you would be trying to get these numbers into your head, you have to be able to relate to them. And it's like, okay, there's repetition, and I can try to remember this, but unless there's a story, something that can help you visualize that either emotionally or actually physically visualize it, then it's really hard to make it stick. And that's really the stuff that you take with you, is the stuff that you have an emotional reaction to, the stuff that you remember. And I think it's important to understand that many of these stories, the conversations that I and others within the profession have with employees, that's a lot of times the most recognition that they're ever going to get. Like, they might not get a big employee award, they might not get highlighted to leadership, but they'll share their story and they'll be able to see it and they'll be able to hear a little bit about themselves and share it with their team. And that gets shared more broadly as the company's understanding what is our experience brand? What are the things that people come for? What are the things that people stay for? Well, that experience and how somebody relates to it, that's recognition for them too. And I think that's one of the most powerful things that a lot of people overlook.
It's a really, really interesting perspective to me, and I just want to sort of share what the parallel is from my perspective. My organization does a lot of leadership development. This is one of the reasons I was excited to have you on this podcast. We do a lot of leadership development. Well, part of helping leaders understand their leadership practice is, what is their leadership brand? And then how do they tell stories around that brand that are compelling and convincing and motivating, not only downward in the organization to their teams that they lead, but also in an upward fashion, so that, executive leadership, or, board or owners, organization owners, also can understand their value proposition. And so it's delightful to have somebody who's a professional storyteller. Even though your focus is more on HR branding and in the HR space, I think what we're going to talk about today is going to apply to all of those audiences.
For sure. Because I think that and this is part of a bigger conversation. That's why you have conversations, right? So you can step back and continue to understand how the pieces fit together. But for employer branding, recruitment marketing, internal comms, all of those are typically, they're problem solvers. And so when you think about, why does a company focus on its employer brand? Why does a company want to understand it, elevate it, and then put it in front of people? Well, most of the time they're doing it because they have a problem attracting talent, either because they have a brand that's misaligned with where they are or where they want to go, or they don't have a brand and they're trying to establish it. They're trying to let people know what kind of experience people are going to have while they're there, while they're contributing their expertise, their energy, their time, their creativity, all of those things. And so for me, it's actually something that is the last exercise I went through. We did a big cultural research project, and we were like, okay, what is the reason people came here? What motivates them? What do they like about their experience? And then why do they stay? What are the things that keep them motivated? What are the things that they like to tell their friends, their family, their the people who are in their lives? How do they talk about what they do to them? And it's in those words, it's in that expression. Oh, here's how I'm connected to something bigger than myself. Or here's how I feel like I'm supporting this thing that's worth supporting. So it's not just a way to attract talent. It absolutely works to attract talent, but it's not just for that. It's for the people who are in your organization today, especially during times of change, especially during times of growth or uncertainty. They need to know, why are we here? What are we trying to do? What is the reason behind the decisions and the strategy that we're pushing forward with? Why are we doing these things, and understanding how they fit in that picture? So the number one goal for doing a culture exercise is, in my opinion, should be to understand how to engage the people who are at your company, but then how to align to the direction that you're going, especially if the direction that you're going is different than where you were headed when they may have joined the company.
I love everything about this perspective. And you didn't exactly say this, but it's on my mind. I think that a cultural assessment doing it in a formal, in a formal process is something that probably should be done on a semi-regular basis. I don't know what the right interval would be here, every 5 years or every.
It depends on how much change the organization goes through. Because if you can have a company that doesn't really change, or the things impacting the business decisions haven't changed for 5 years, but like you probably have other things that have changed along the way. There's very few industries that are not reacting to some sort of sea change, particularly right now. But in my opinion, I would say, these are my favorite two first word answers, by the way, is it depends. But I would say it depends on how much change a company is experiencing. Has there been a merger or an acquisition? Has there been a strategic shift? Has there been a leadership shift? Has there been a change in laws or other compliances that change how the company has to do business? All of those things are reasons to reevaluate your culture and why people stay.
And then the idea of that reevaluation, I think the benefit of it from my perspective is the opportunity then to realign and recalibrate. And that by itself is sort of an interesting topic to me, because if you're an employee and you're in an organization and the assessment gets done, it gives you a chance to go, oh, wait a minute, I'm not behaving in alignment with the culture or with the values of the organization, and I can self-correct. Or it gives that employee the opportunity to say, there was a shift here that doesn't align with my values, and I shouldn't be here anymore. I don't belong here anymore. And, then can sort of make the choice of, making a different employment decision. I love everything about that component.
I was going to say a less subtle way to say that has been said a few different times over the years is you figure out, am I in the right seat on this bus, or do I need to get off the bus?
Get off the bus. Exactly right. I was at Apple for a little over 10 years in the early days, and I'm not sure if they still do this, but back then they offered a 6-week sabbatical at the end of 5 years of service. And on the surface, it was presented as an employee benefit, something special and unique. But the really deep thinking behind the sabbatical strategy was exactly to answer this question. Apple and organizations like Apple demand a lot from people. Everything in a lot of cases. And you have to ask yourself, after 5 years of that, do I want more? And that sabbatical is a really, really good break for you to sort of decompress a little and then make that assessment. Should I be on the bus or not?
Yeah. And I think we talk a lot about regrettable attrition in organizations. I say we, the collective. Everybody's out there, right? You hear the royal we. We hear a lot about, why is, like, we're having attrition, people are leaving, and then the first assumption a lot of people make is, what's wrong? Why are people leaving? What's happening? What's changing? What's going on? Why are the people jumping ship? And I think that is very, very valid. And I think that's sometimes like an indicator. Okay, why are people leaving? And there needs to be a story there. There needs to be a reference point. This was happening. This impacted them. They were making these decisions, and it's expensive. It costs a lot of money to replace the knowledge that leaves an organization. It costs a lot of money in opportunity costs, as well as time, as the cost of morale on the team, depending upon why people left. All of these things, there's layers, right, to why we focus on regrettable attrition. And one of the things that we don't focus on a lot is regrettable retention. And that's when people stay because they don't have another opportunity, or they are holding out hope that the company that they joined will reappear again. If there's been a lot of change, if decisions were made that didn't align with that, or if their experience changes or strategic direction or the opportunity that showed up for them is no longer there. All of those things, right? And depending upon the industry, depending upon the organization and the person's role, there might not be opportunities out there. And it makes it really hard to tell yourself, okay, I can't align with this. So we make up our own story. We say, oh, well, if the company's not talking about this thing that I'm pretty sure is different now, then I can make up that narrative and I can be okay and I can make peace with it because I've got a steady paycheck and because I've got stability, the perception of stability, and I've got all these things, and I get to maintain and do this because this is the story that I'm going to keep telling myself to be okay with all of this. And so you have people who are doing that, but psychologically we know that things come out as part of that process, and people that the apples turn sour, and people are they become insubordinate in different ways, or they're passive aggressive. There's all these ways that come out where they're actively aggressive and they're talking about things that are changing and they're upset about it and they want other people to know that they're upset. So all those things are affecting the overall culture of the organization. And that's the regrettable retention, in that sometimes people don't have the opportunities to leave, or they are choosing not to see that the organization they work for today is not the one that they joined.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, this is just such a deep well for me when we talk about leadership and leadership practice. And, one of the things that I have a pretty high sensitivity to is when you have people that have, regrettably stayed when, the right answer was they should have a different opportunity somewhere else to find their alignment and their purpose. And how toxic that can become, and how even just one on the team can absolutely disenfranchise a whole team, can disrupt a whole operation, can, and from my perspective, the risk is never worth it. Even if that person is, individually a high performer or a subject matter expert, it's almost never worth it to retain that kind of talent when it sort of poisons the well. That's again, we could probably have a whole conversation on that topic alone.
Well, I'll tell you, I have more than once in my career, I have stayed longer than I should have. I've definitely made that mistake, and it's understanding when you see the certain signs, like in retrospect, I'm like, oh, that was the moment when I was working for the RPO, recruitment process outsourcing company, and the president of the company, when I was talking to him about social media back when social media was an early thing, and there were all these, social media experts and gurus and everything who were, trying to ride that wave. I was looking at it going, well, this is just another engagement tool. How do we take advantage of this? What should we be doing? We should be showing up. We should be part of the conversation. And in that moment, the president goes, but that's not recruiting. And I'm like, you're thinking only about the business end of recruiting. You're not thinking about the personal human side of recruiting. It is totally about recruiting. And it's about helping people show up and be human and share their details and connect with things, because it's the connection that keeps people there. The job offer, the money, the benefits, the prestige, that might get them there, but it's the human stuff that keeps people there and motivates people to make those changes. That, in retrospect, was the moment I should have left that company. I stayed another 2 years, and that was way longer than I should have. But I know that now, so I keep my eye out for it.
Yeah, and again, your manager at the time, if they had much of a leadership practice, would have helped you see that sooner rather than later, and then would have helped you move forward. But again, that's a whole nother conversation. I'd like to pivot into the internal transformation, and in our previous conversations, the way you framed this was This story is about going backwards to be able to move forwards. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think this for me is understanding where you want to end up. And there's a couple different ways that to look at it. One is in the personal sense and one is in the business sense. In the personal sense, there are people all the time who make what look like, steps back in order to take a different path. And I think that you have to figure out, was I going the right way? And I've been in organizations where they have this one particular case, things had been moving so fast and so furiously that there were decisions that were made really quickly. And, in hindsight, 2-3 years later, it's, oh, those were not the right decisions we should have made. We have to step back from that decision, and we have to be able to go forward on a new path. And there were a couple different ways that company decided to do that. One was in function, in that everything was in a fast moving company. You're making bets. You're trying to figure out, like, okay, we think this is going to happen, so let's make investments here. And so for one of the functions in this company, it did not have the growth path that they thought it was going to have, and it kind of flatlined, actually. But it was hard, again, to figure out, do we go the right direction? Where do we go from here? How long are we going to wait in order to make the decision that we made this mistake? Let's acknowledge it, and let's change, and let's pivot. And so the one way internally was to realign that business. And that meant some roles were going to go away. And the other piece was looking at geographically, where in the world was this company doing business? And through that growth, through acquisition, and through just moving so fast, it took for granted that an engineering office in Eastern Europe was going to be the right path forward because it was part of another acquisition. Okay, that's going to be where we have this engineering function. And 5 years later, it was like, okay, this was a mistake, and we needed to shift, and we need to move those jobs. We need to move that function to a different place where the time zone can be a little bit friendlier, when we'll have a little more control over it, have a little bit less of the technical debt. But those are two of the big drivers. And those were things that were happening at the same time when the leader of the organization said, okay, who by the way, had just gone through another huge merger, had said, we need to figure out what the culture looks like now. We need to focus on the culture and understand it. So I jumped in and I said, okay, we need to do an assessment. We need to talk to executives, but more importantly, we need to talk to teams, people who are individual contributors, people who understand why they joined and why they're staying, and understand what's important to them. And I think that's one of the biggest learnings, was you can talk about culture. And by the way, we defined it because we went through that exercise. We're like, okay, well, let's define our culture, because it's one of those words that you ask 10 people what culture means to them, and you're going to get 10 different answers, right?
Right.
And so for us, we had to say, well, let's baseline. Culture is the way we show up for each other, and it's straightforward. It's pretty vague, but it does, like, okay, well, yeah, just about everything can go through that filter of how are we showing up for each other? How are we showing up to support one another? How are we showing up to hold each other accountable? How are we showing up to give each other feedback? How are we showing up, literally, how are we showing up in the office? How are we showing, like, all of those places where, like, this is how we show up for each other. So we said, great, that'll be the culture. And then we went to understand, what are the gaps between the culture that exists, that we see, and then the culture that we are telling ourselves exists, because we haven't done a good job of clarifying the direction that we're going. We've had all this change, but we haven't said, this is what's important. This is the direction that we're going. This is what's valuable. And then here are the ways we're going to hold ourselves accountable moving forward. And so that was the challenge, is understanding the direction, but then mapping that back to how's it going to show up in performance? How's it going to show up in onboarding? How's it going to show up in all the touch points that affect the experience that our people are going through day to day? And then how are we going to hold the leaders accountable for holding their people accountable? It's like this, it's everything is connected, and there are these strings that are these threads that are connecting everything. It's like, how are we going to be able to do that, to actually create and uphold the kind of place that needs to exist for us to be successful? And that was one of the biggest challenges, and one of the places where I've made some of the biggest mistakes in my career.
Yeah, you and I had a previous conversation about making mistakes, and my perspective on making mistakes is that failure is a magnificent teacher, and yet we probably don't give enough time, whether it's introspecting or retrospecting those mistakes, and then really, how can you synthesize and then distill, the lessons that then serve you later on. And we often don't look at that enough, I think. You said something as you started to tell that story that I thought was really interesting and insightful, which is you have an idea of where you want to go when it comes to transformation. Stephen Covey, in his 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, call that begin with the end in mind. That's the habit. And I agree with that completely. In fact, I think the big core elements of transformation is, where are you today? And you should have a really good assessment of what that looks like. You should be assessing your people, your processes, your technology, your operations, along with, your key business metrics. But then you should have a lot of clarity on what your desired state is. If you don't have the clarity of where you want to go, it's impossible for people to align around it. But once you do have clarity around where you want to go, that's then where transformation can make a difference. Transformation can build the bridge between your current state and your desired state. And I'm shocked sometimes when I see people who are driving the strategy for change or driving the change itself without having complete clarity of what their desired state, what their end state should look like. It sounds like that may have been a problem here. One of the things, not to ramble, but one of the things that came to mind is, I think you used the timeline of 5 years, that they decided 5 years later that they needed to pivot. And I think to myself, I don't know what the life cycle of the product or the business is, but if it takes you 5 years to figure out you didn't get it right, there's probably something else going on here that we ought to be paying attention to.
Yeah. And I don't think it took 5 years. I think it took probably between 2 and 3 years to really understand it. But then, because of other things that were happening, so much other change that was impacting it, it was like, well, that's kind of simmering. We can let that simmer for a while, or it's not the hottest burner. And so understanding that we have these challenges to face, that's why it was 2 years of the organization knowing that there was a problem, but then being able to actually affect that change. And it was, okay, how do we move forward? How do we secure market the market leadership position that we have? And so that's it. And so when money's coming in, when there's a lot of success, there are several things that end up sitting on that back burner and bubbling and just continuing to kind of calcify and do those things, because the focus is on, how do we make sure the success, the money, the revenue, how do we make sure that continues to flow, even though we've got other things within the organization that have problems and are not functioning the way that we want them to function, right? We as humans can only deal with the loudest thing or the most pressing, dangerous thing at the time. And that's it. We have to simplify and understand that only so many things can get addressed at once.
Mm-hmm. Mm. If you were to thinking about this internal transformation story, what was the one thing that you're taking away that's most profound for you, whether it was educational or whether it was a reinforcement of your approach or strategy? What's the biggest takeaway for you?
From this particular one, the biggest takeaway from me is outlining outlining the end state and making sure that the right partners are in the room from the beginning. For me, there were political, I'll say, rifts, and because of that, decisions were made about who's going to be involved, who's going to be in the room, who's going to have a voice as we go through this process to codify our culture, to codify our values, and to understand how that's represented. And so I let that happen. And that was one of my biggest takeaways. That when I say I let that happen, I mean I fought it. I should have fought harder. And for me, it was understanding like what should have been a deal breaker was to make sure that the people with the right voices should have been involved from the start, so that at the end they knew what was coming. They felt like they had a hand in it, and they felt like the reasoning behind it was going to help their world as well.
Yeah. Key stakeholder engagement, key stakeholder management are sometimes elements that get missed in the strategy, the planning, and the execution of transformation. So that insight is pretty brilliant about making sure, back to the bus analogy, that we've got the right people on the bus.
Well, and not even it's that, but it like even going a step further is going, okay, the two most critical pieces of information that you mentioned were determine where you are and determine where you want to go. And if you've ever used GPS, you know that if either one of those is not accurate, you're not going to end up where you want to be.
Exactly right. If it doesn't know where you are, it can't help you get to where you want to be.
Exactly.
And
Those
if it doesn't know
step-by-step
where you're
directions are
going,
not going to help you.
yeah, that's funny. Awesome. Well, we also talked about an external transformation that you worked on, and this one caught my eye. You said this external transformation was about learning to run before learning to walk. Tell me more about that.
I was with a company that was a self-proclaimed startup, had been around for a while, and it was in the energy space, and it was trying to, as with many things, you have venture capital dollars, you have boards, you have all of these things that are driving the decisions that a business is making. And in this particular scenario, the company was like, hey, we're too dependent on the price of a certain commodity. Let's diversify. We need to diversify. When we have money, we have venture capital dollars. Let's go diversify. Let's go acquire some businesses that help us spread that around. And so they did. They went and hurried up, and so they ran. And they said, okay, you're a business. You do this. This kind of fits in this scenario. So, like, are you for sale? Are you for sale? You kind of fit. Are you for sale? And they ran, and they were in such a hurry to diversify for whatever reason, right? Either it was like timeline driven. We only had access to this cash for a certain amount of a certain runway, but they really quickly acquired a bunch of companies, and they were companies that kind of made sense. They weren't really aligned to the actual mission and the end result that they were originally focused on. So what happened was, over a period of a pretty short while, like just a few years, they realized, one, it was a mistake. Two, we don't know how to run these businesses. We don't understand how to make them successful. And this isn't actually aligned to what we said our goal was. So they went through all that process to go, okay, well, market's going through some downturn, and we feel like we probably need to protect ourselves. So let's go ahead and divest from some of these companies. And they did it. And it was the majority of those companies. And that meant that almost half of the company was going to lose their jobs. And so like they kept the core business, but they cut some of the support staff, as well as sold off the majority of those businesses, and that deeply changed the trajectory that the company was on, and it changed the experience and the give and the get, that exchange where someone says, this is what I'm going to give to you, this is what I'm expecting in return, and what is that going to give me now? It was very, very different. It's another instance of, this is no longer the company that I joined. Now what? Now how do I make peace with that? And so we went through that process, and we started internally with the talent team, and we said, okay, talent team, this is happening. We're going to have to deal with this. We're going to have to help build a bridge for the company to get where we need to go. So let's start with us. So we got into a room and we said, what's broken? What's happening? Why all these things are signals, they're impacting us. How do we make peace with it? How do we process it? And we wrote a lot of stuff down. We had hours in a room where we wrote down all the things that you might not say in public. We just got the poison out, and it was like, these are all the things that happen, and here are the things that we think we're really good at. What could we really succeed at, and how can we take that forward? Went through that process, shared that information back with the chief people officer, and the chief people officer said, whoa, okay, this is what we need for the whole organization. And we're like, great. He's like, can you do this? Can you build this? Can you execute this in a month? Can you scale it? And I said, okay, yes, we can, but these are the things that I need. I need your promise that we're not doing this as a one-off, that we're building something to actually help you understand what matters to the company. Because if it's a one-off, then it's an emergency room visit. It's not a healthcare and a wellness routine, right? Exactly. And so I said, hey, this needs to be a program, and I need to be able to do this. I need not a lot of resources, just some. Like I need a couple pairs of hands, and I need some money to buy some pizza. He was like, what? And I was like, we're gonna have to feed these people. We're gonna pull them in. We need you're also gonna need to communicate to your leaders that we're gonna be pulling their people in for these conversations, and so we could pull and do. And literally, what we did a culture assessment. But I lovingly referred to it as being a server at a restaurant, dumping some hot soup in a patron's lap, and then putting a comment card at their table. And so you're like, what's going to be on that card? What information? Well, you just laid off almost half the company, and everybody who was already stretched, already stressed, they're going to be feeling a certain way about it. So you're going to get, most of what you're going to get back from them, but you have to let them get that out so that you can move forward and understand what they need as you're rebuilding to move forward. So we went through that, and we did I want to say we did between 15 and 20% of the organization. We pulled them in for sessions, built it out. Like, these are the things that are happening. What are the things that you've seen? What do you want to get out? What do you want to express? What do you need? What do you love about what we do? What brought you here? What keeps you here? A lot of these overlap, right, with the stories of why are you here? What's important to you? And it gave people a chance to express some things that maybe they didn't feel safe enough to express previously. So we started with a 90-minute session. The very first one, 90 minutes. Let's do it. Let's pull people in. We started the process, went through. We had presentation in order to get the conversation started. We're like, these are the things that we're going to be talking about now. Let's move forward. We had one person leave ahead of the 90-minute mark, and they said, I got to go. I have another meeting. I got to go. Okay, great. Well, like, thank you for joining, well, thank you for participating. And they left. And it went from 90 minutes, we continued, and everybody stayed in that room, and almost at the 3-hour mark, 3 hours, the person came back in and said, "Thank goodness you're still here. I want to finish this." And they came back into the room to do this. So providing that space and doing it in such a way where they felt safe and they felt like they could talk about the things that were real, in their words, quote unquote, better than therapy. People were listening. We were listening. We were providing that space, and we were making sure that they understood what we were going to do with their feedback moving forward. We did that, like I said, with a percentage of the company, and we developed from that. It was a combination of the qualitative feedback, the quotes and the things that they said. We didn't attribute to people, but we did say, like, hey, we're going to capture these quotes. We're going to write them down so that we know what was said, but we're not going to like say so-and-so said this. So they knew they were in a safe place. So we took that qualitative feedback, and then we also gave a quantitative measure for how would you rate these specific things that we talked about. So you set the stage with the in-person session, and then you followed up literally in less than an hour after they left their session. They were like, okay, this is the second part. You got to complete this. So we set that expectation in the session, and that turned into an organizational health index. And it turned into our way of measuring ongoing every month. How is the company doing? What's happening? Where are the gaps in expectation, in knowledge? Where are there issues that we need to deal with? And then started sharing that information at the company-wide meetings. Here's where we are. Here's our score. And here are some of the things that made up that score. And so we shared that continually. We had that feedback. And then we took all of those and we shared it with the functional leaders. And we told them, not only here's how the company's doing, here's how your team is doing. And here are the trouble spots, and here are the things that we recommend. So setting that up, I part of me, as I play that back, it's like, wait, you did it every month? Or how often did you send out that survey? Didn't everybody get fatigue? Weren't they sick of providing that response, that feedback? And the answer was no, because they got reinforcement that their feedback was being used. That everybody, we talked about it, we socialized it.
They had the sense that they were being heard, that their engagement, their investment of time to provide the data wasn't going into some black hole and being ignored. They were being heard, and actions were being taken. I think that's a really, really key component. I know a guy who owns a company that does these kinds of surveys, and on a regular basis, just like you described. They may do them as frequently as monthly. He said the key to those kinds of surveys is that you have to keep them short and focus on the most important components, and make sure that the audience is able to see that you're using the feedback to make decisions in the organization. Those components will make one of these kinds of surveys where you don't have an issue with survey fatigue, as you mentioned.
And I think it's important to note, like, I agree that they have to be short. They have to be quick. They have to feel light based upon the circumstances. Like I said, soup dropped in your lap as a restaurant patron. Like, there needed to be some time dedicated. So we stayed in that room as long as people wanted to stay in that room. And that's where the 90-minute session turned into over a 3-hour session. But yes, ongoing, you don't need that. Ongoing, it becomes a lot more lightweight.
And Bryan, same question as the internal transformation. What's the biggest thing that you took away from that experience? What did you learn there that's really stuck with you?
For me, it's understanding that you have to be upfront about about the requirements. People can say they want a thing, but they won't necessarily know what they're going to do once they get that thing. And so you have to build in that expectation. Say, okay, well, if you get this, you got to do something with the data. You have to actually put it in front of your leaders, and then you have to hold your leaders accountable for doing it. And so for me, I think building that extension of how are we going to continually hold our leaders accountable for that, that was a big learning for me, and not taking for granted the all the things that people tell themselves and they tell each other that never bubbles up to leadership. Like there's a huge gap there in some instances, especially when there's the perception of no psychological safety.
Oh, right, right.
So it's the headlines look very, very different from a leader's perspective than they do from someone who's a little bit closer to the ground.
Well, Bryan, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, rich and deep. I want to ask you a couple of questions a little bit about you. One of my favorite questions that I ask all of my guests, what was the best pieces of advice you received and didn't take?
Okay. How personal can I go?
You can go as personal as you want. You can have as much fun or seriousness as you want.
Okay. So I'm going to tell something on the personal side. I will share that a long time ago, I was meeting a buddy of mine for dinner at a restaurant, and one of the things that I do is I seek out people who are a good balance for my personality type. And so I look for like, okay, what things are they bringing? Like how do those things meet? Like I try not to just connect with someone who's exactly like me, because that's where you don't learn, you don't stretch, you got to be uncomfortable a little bit. But I do that. Somebody that I've known for a long time. We were eating, and he got up to use the restroom. I'm looking around, and I see someone who's at the bar, and they turn, and it's this woman, it's this beautiful woman, and she turns and looks like she's just like locking eyes with me for what felt like 10 seconds. It might have been 2. But I was like, wow, okay, there's some interest there. And I was just like, wow, okay. And I was like, I hope I didn't have something in my teeth. I was like, I don't know what's going on. My buddy came back, and he's, we're just eating, and I was like, hey, it's like, you see that woman over by the bar? And he's like, yeah. I was like, yeah, the one in the white top. You see her? He's like, yeah. And I said, you think I should go talk to her? And he stops, and he looks up, kind of cranes his neck. No. And he keeps eating. And I'm just like, wow, okay. And I'm like filtering at light speed, right? So what do I do? How do I receive that? And I just go, okay. I get up, and I walk straight over, like, and my buddy's like, what are you doing? And I walk straight over to her and introduce myself. And that conversation was short, it was powerful, it was personal. The whole time my buddy's like pulling on my sleeve, like, let's go, let's get out of here. And she and I are connecting, and we're talking, and come to find out she's an artist and all these things. And she had just broken up with someone and said, like, I'm done with relationships for like a year. She'd just gotten off a bad relationship. And she said, no more. And then I walked up and introduced myself, and we're talking. And the moral of the story is twofold. One, there was a TV behind me, so she was not looking at me. I didn't know that at the time. And two, when I started walking out with my buddy, and I paused again, and I said, and I was just like, one of those moments that says, if I don't do something, I'm going to regret it. So I stopped at the parking lot, turned around, walked back in, And I walked up to her and I said, "Hey," and she goes, "You want my number?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And got it. And that is the woman that I will be married to for 20 years this September.
Congratulations. I love this story.
So understanding you don't have to have it perfect. You absolutely are going to see things that don't exist. But if you have that instinct to grab something, to do it, to build it, to go for it, then you should do it. And I think that's one of the big things that I didn't take his advice. I didn't back down. I didn't just accept my scenario, and I'm really glad I didn't.
Wow, that's phenomenal. What a great story. Thank you for sharing that. In a similar vein, since we're talking about giving advice, when you think about, newer professionals coming into either the HR space or the branding space or the talent space, if you could only share one perspective or piece of advice that would help them be successful, what would that be?
I would say across the board, between HR, branding, recruitment, marketing, all of those, we're at a liminal moment now with AI and what it can automate, what it can do, and how we can remove ourselves from the process. And I think that as we race to automate what AI can do, we have to ask ourselves what AI should do. And I think that's preserving the human elements of the story, the experience, the process. And I think understanding where that value is being added. We talk about what are the things that a AI or machine learning or a process can take away in the name of efficiency. We also have to ask ourselves, where are we adding value as humans? The people with the stutter, the people with the pause, the people who give the space for others to show up as humans as well. How are we adding that value and holding on to that, preserving that aspect? I think that's one of the most important things that somebody could do today, is not ask where we can pull humans out, but where we need to keep humans as a critical part.
Okay, good. And, again, in that same vein, what advice would you give to a peer? Something that you've learned, something that's become, foundational for you, that's contributed to your success. What would you want them to know?
For peers in the space, it gets easier. I've been doing this work for 20 years. It gets easier, but you always have to demand more. What do they say? The closed mouth never gets fed. You have to be talking, you have to be asking, you have to be sharing information, you have to be vocal, you have to be heard. And it's understanding how you fit within the organization and your impact that drives headcount, budget, permission, even, and buy-in, even if it's philosophical buy-in. So it's understanding how you can show up as a vocal representation of that culture, that need, that solution, so that you can get the headcount, so you can get the budget, so you can get the buy-in. And buy-in can be something as simple as your CEO, your leader, expressing how important culture is as people relate to the work that they do, and you just being there to tell that story. I think that's one of the things that people need to take away from this work.
Okay. Brilliant. Bryan, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward for others to see this episode and extract some value from it. Speaking of value, it was a pleasure to speak with you.
Likewise. Thank you, Jeff.
And I'll see you around the block.
Sounds good.
All right. Take care.
The Transformational Leadership Podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes vision, action, diagnostics, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, be sure to let us know in the comments. We'd love you to join the conversation and help us transform the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are transforming organizations, leaders, and teams. In the meantime, be sure to like, subscribe, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.